Welcome, everyone. I'm Phyllis Klein, and this is Poets in Conversation. And today we have Doug Ramspeck and Nancy Kerrigan reading from their books, both published by Grayson Books. And I'm going to start now with a poem, one of my poems from my book, The Full Moon Herald. It's called Life in the Slow Lane. And it's about it started off as an idea that I got after reading a book called The Hidden Life of Trees. And here's how it goes. Life in the Slow Lane. Hold me in your branches, and I will speak to you through our roots, intertwined in our bed, our bedroom of orchids, our kitchen window redwood, our rooms connected like living telephone wires, our bodies, our pheromones singing arias, the microbes who call us home, riding on our backs into the jungle of our city. Let us be silent like the trees, endure pain with dignity, leafy or bare, dressed or naked. Be patient for the ecstasy of life, patient for the ice, the wind, patient for warmth. Let us give space the way trees grow their branches, so light reaches every leaf of every tree. Welcome cats, birds, monkeys, and snakes. Welcome. And let us endure leaf-eating pests and mammals, mold, rot, drought, and flood. Let us make seeds and cones to fly on winds of longing, seeds to fly into us as we hold each other, as we speak through our roots, the soft, damp sky filled with birds calling. So now I'm going to introduce Nancy Kerrigan. And here's what I'm going to say about Nancy. Nancy grew up in Chicago and later moved to Connecticut. She went to school at Wesleyan University Writers. She's an alumnus of Wesleyan University's Writers Week, and also has gone to workshops at Frost Place in Franconia, New Hampshire. She is the author of 2 chapbooks, The Voices, The Poetry of Psychiatry, and High Heels and Sneakers, both published by Finishing Line Press. She has shared her poetry in many venues, including Ireland. And she's a psychotherapist and worked in hospitals and private practice. And that's taught her a lot about the human condition. So at this reading, she's going to be reading from her book, Lucky Enough, A Journey, taking us from Chicago to Hartford to Ireland and back to the mind's eye and the heart of the home, through a life lived and into others imagined, hearing what mother said and feeling what a daughter hoped. We've got Rosa on the bus, Kennedy in the car, a poet on Clare Island, a loving whisper in the ear. Count yourself fortunate to have lucky enough in yours. And so with that, I'm going to pass over the mic to Nancy.
Good evening, everyone. Cade Me Lafalchian is Irish for 100,000 welcomes. Thanks, Phyllis, for all you've done to see that this poetry reading has come to pass. As Phyllis said, my name is Nancy Kerrigan. I'm the poet, not the ice skater. She and I have never met, but what's really weird is we have the same birthday, but not the same year. I'm going to read 6 poems to you tonight. Not all of them, most of them not about Ireland, but I'm going to start out with my first being entitled Royalty. It was prompted by going to an exhibit at the American Textile Museum in Lowell, Massachusetts in 1998. And I dedicate this one to my mother. It is entitled Royalty. Princess Diana's dresses under plexiglass. I strolled this exhibition for humanity with solemn schoolgirls in jeans and sneakers who stare at the splendor, then gaze at blue jean mommies. Each reads about the galas where these gowns made an entrance to dance, outliving the royal who gave them scent, swing, and rustle. No music, soft lights, whispering 1, 2, left, right. We knew everything and nothing of this woman's life. I lament Diana had no daughters. You had two. You held court in the powder room. With my braids done and jumper on, I focused my freckled face on you, curling your eyelashes, straightening your seams before you slipped on your platform high heels, your face mysterious behind the veil of your hat. The final curtain before we left for the ballet. You in a soft fur coat, your perfume filled the soft, small space like incense. Alone, your scent eludes me. I search perfumeries, discontinued. You are on the magazine covers in my mind, as beautiful as any goddess Diana. Not a commonplace mother, the pages of your life, no fairy tale. My love, there is no place to wear a wide brim hat and white gloves. We dressed for a dance where pants would do, high heels instead of sensible shoes. Dressed for a life we did not lead. If we were not royalty, we never knew. Our femininity fashioned by you. My next poem is published in Ginny Connor's anthology of Forgotten Woman. And it is entitled For the Women Who Ride Buses. Rosa, since 1955, you sat and sat in our minds on that Montgomery City bus, would not give up your seat to a white man. You were not the first Black woman who refused to go to the back of the bus, but you are the one etched in the black and white of our memory. You sat there dignified in your cloth coat with your hat on, staring out that bus window. Were you planning dinner under that hat, plotting to change history, or just plain tired? How many bus rides did it take to make you seethe, steam rising up through your straw pillbox hat before you decided not to move? Your own name not among the P's in my 1980 encyclopedia. In that decade of Father Knows Best, my mother worked outside the home too, wearing a hat much like yours. Often she neglected to take it off while she cooked dinner. Mornings she ran in high heels to catch her 2 buses. consumed one library book after the next, the commute so long. Some days the rain washed away her makeup, or was it the rain? Thanks to the women who traveled unfamiliar routes before me, I drive to my own office where I listen to the plight of women, not behind the wheels of their lives, waiting in the rain for buses to take them to the night shift at Walmart. This next poem is a form poem, in the form of a pantoum. And what I've discovered is a poet is occasionally abiding by a form helps write when the poem is focused on emotions that are high. It is entitled An Open Wound. Each generation has diseases to dread. Galloping consumption was the name for Dad's lung disease. From the age of 6, I heard coughing in our home. Dad worked when he could, Mom worked when he couldn't. Galloping consumption was the name for Dad's lung disease. An open, fist-sized surgical wound on his back kept draining. Dad worked when he could, Mom worked when he couldn't. We all learned to change the dressing on his back. An open fist-sized surgical wound on his back kept draining. Dad lay down to have it changed. Mom made faces he never saw. We all learned to change the dressing on his back. Bakery eclairs for dessert when he sold insurance he couldn't get. Dad lay down to have it changed. Mom made faces he never saw. My goal to be a nurse, get smart and make him feel better. Bakery eclairs for dessert when he sold insurance he couldn't get. My brother went to the links to change Dad's dressing after golf. My goal to be a nurse, get smart and make him feel better. Outwardly, this was as normal for us as slipping on clean socks. My brother went to the links to change Dad's dressing after golf. When other men looked on, this was something they never forgot. Outwardly, this was as normal for us as slipping on clean socks. When other men looked on, this was something they'd never forget. He left 3 college graduates without a penny in student debt. Each generation has diseases to dread. Now I'm going to read a poem about Chicago in the 1960s. It's a poem that is the title of my manuscript, and it speaks to pride in one's heritage while at the same time making fun of it. Lucky Enough, Chicago, 1960. If you're lucky enough to be Irish in America, storytelling is in your bones. You build tales about what you remember as well as what you don't. Storytelling, not a side dish, rather an entree at any celebration. If you're lucky enough to be Irish, you could sell an Eskimo a refrigerator, but never teach an Italian how to cook. Without those paisans, you and yours would endure another great famine. If you're lucky enough to be Irish, subverting the oppressor is an intricate marker woven into your DNA. One Irish Catholic so adept he charms a Chicago mayor and a few Protestants to advance his campaign. If you're lucky enough to be Irish, you commiserate with Jewish girls. Not easy to find in the neighborhood. Learn Jews atone only once a year, while Catholics go weekly to confess, confess, confess. If you're lucky enough to be Irish, you call your friends Dago, Wap, Polak, Mick. You slap your cronies on the back, but there are a few others whose only concerns are that outsiders might move into upend home values. If you're lucky enough to be Irish, you dream about Latin lovers. Any book entitled Irish Erotic Art you know is full of blank pages. If you're even luckier to be Irish and female, you become linked to women all over the world who think like the Blessed Mother, think their sons are God. If you're lucky enough to be Irish, you're lucky enough. Okay, and this next poem is a fun poem, and it's a poem about change and risk. It is published in the anthology Voices from the Frost Place in 2004 by Sidney Leah. And it is entitled The Purple Metallic Convertible. The purple metallic convertible was the last loaner on the lot on a top-down day in May. With the family sedan safely in the mechanic's hand, I peeled away from the dealership. Convertibles automatically subtract 10 years off your driver's license. Midlife mother became Lolita in sunglasses with blonde hair flying in a car I'd never pick. Drivers honked as my briefcase bounced to the Beach Boys. Fun, fun, fun till her daddy takes her T-bird away. Sometimes a day just takes you. Sometimes a day just takes you like a $100 bill in an envelope day, or a sudden call from a long-lost lover day that takes you to a secret room in yourself, and you burst right through its closed door in a purple metallic convertible with the Beach Boys blaring, and you do something you have never done before, like blow off a workday, or spend all the money on yourself, or go out with a married man. And even if it rained all day on the beach, or the money only purchased useless lottery tickets, or the long-lost lover was nothing more than an oil slick, that night in the convertible, with your hair hung over the headrest, while you're gazing at the moonlit night, you feel satisfied that you sampled the cookies when they were passed, that you searched around in that room that you never explored. Sometimes we just need to shift into another gear. Okay, and my last poem is a poem about obsession and grief. And I wrote it in a workshop where we were suggested that we write a poem about obsession. Man, it was all too easy for me. The poem is entitled, I'm watching the television show of my life. Again, it's a renewing dramatic series. I'm obsessed with the script. Just an ordinary love story that includes a train wreck. Cars collide, go off the rails, blinded by the sun. Some can't see what's to come. Hospitals visited all day long, all day long. Live with it, live with it. Patients can't get off this train. I want to get off this train. I want them to get off this train with me. A child sings, Hey Jude, make it better, better, better. Cooking smells, school bells. I get off that train and onto another. Operatic music plays in the background. Conti partero. Time to say goodbye. A rusty, leaky faucet drips down all day long, all day long. Some others try to turn it off, like parrots repeat, it's not your fault, it's not your fault. Back to the script, revise. I can't say goodbye. I can't get to a different ending. Shame colors my eyes turn green, puddles of rusty water deepen. I stand alone at a casket. I hear a voice with no one else in the parlor. You did nothing wrong, nothing wrong. Forgiveness comes to visit, but won't stay long. Please, God, change the channel. Thank you, everybody, for listening to what I love to write.
Oh, thank you, Nancy. Thank you so much. That was a lovely reading. And I wanted to read another quote from the back of your book. Here's the
Thank
front
you.
cover. Beautiful photograph. Our
That's
publisher knows how to pick them. Yeah.
That's my only photograph that I've ever taken that was worth putting on a cover of anything.
You took, where was this? Where did you take it?
That was in Connemara, Ireland. I was so happy to be there. I just jumped out of the car and took it.
Gorgeous. Wow.
Thank you.
So on the back, Tommy Shea, who's a Pulitzer Prize nominee, says this collection pulses with an Irish heartbeat, but you don't have to be Irish to love its images. I can attest to that. Its emotions, its evocations of a time gone by and the time that lives on. Lucky us. And I just thought that was so funny about the Jewish girls and how they only had to
atone once a
for
year.
Yom Kippur.
Great.
Yeah. So thanks again, Nancy. But for now, I'm going to introduce Doug. Doug Ramspeck is the author of 8 poetry collections, 1 collection of short stories, and a novella. I'll just read a few of his previous book titles: Black Flowers, The Owl That Carries Us Away, and Original Bodies. Wonderful titles. And Doug has won a lot of prizes and awards, too many to name right now. And he's been very, very well published. And he's a retired professor of English. I think he might have just recently retired, so we can find out more about that. From the Ohio State University at Lima, where he taught creative writing. He's going to be reading mostly tonight from his book Distant Fires, which is the winner of the Grayson Book Award for 2020. Here's a quote from the back of that book. This book illuminates the humanity and voice of a brother who was imprisoned and died, giving insight into the difficulty of fathoming another's heart. And so I'm going to let Doug continue on from there.
Well, thank you, Phyllis, and thank you for hosting this. And I hope everyone, if they haven't already, pick up your book, The Full Moon Herald, and read it. I want to start just by saying that at the house where I live here in Ohio, with my wife, we have neighborhood cats that come a lot to our bird feeders, and so it kind of becomes a cat feeder as much as a bird feeder if we're not careful. However, we've learned that our dog sees them and will rush to the window and bark loudly and scare the cats away. And so we've learned that if we say cat, our dog will rush to the window and scare the cats away. Of course, we have a cat inside. She's never quite figured out that the cat's inside. The cat inside is also a cat, but in any case, she'll run and scare them away. My wife and I have learned, though, that sometimes we can just say, if our dog is pestering us, we can just say cat, and then she'll run off to the window. But what our poor dog doesn't realize is that human beings are liars. And so sometimes we don't necessarily tell the truth when we say the cat. We're just trying to have a moment to ourselves so that, without her pestering us. Creative writers, of course, call that storytelling rather than lying. And I'm saying that because many of the poems from Distant Fires, I hope have a kind of storytelling truth, but their connection to actual reality is more tenuous. But I'm going to be reading some of the poems, a few poems from Distant Fires, and I hope they tell a kind of story. The first one is entitled Small Nation. The first time my brother and I played chicken on the railroad tracks, we leapt from the bridge before the train was anywhere near us. We splashed down at the same moment, then treaded water while listening to the train, drowning out the sounds of the cicadas. Afterwards, we lay on our backs in the current and watched the eye of the moon rolling back into the skull of the clouds. And we listened to the breezes sifting through the dreadlocks of the willows. And that winter, there was often a live wire of blue light at dusk in the field behind our father's barn, and we studied how it lived inside itself, how it seemed older than the moon, its own small nation. And once we carried saucers onto the garage roof and sledded off the edge into open air, down into a snowdrift, and that was the same winter my brother broke his collarbone twice, and we stole a hunting knife and a hatchet from the unlocked shed of a neighbor. Later, when my brother went to prison, I would tell myself that something was already forming on those days and nights of our childhood, was already formed, even though we leapt with equal abandon toward the river. The next poem in the collection is called User Manual. Our mother used to say prayers for our father's temper, as though it were a thing living separate from the man, some volatile creature that might be tamed with soft words or clasped hands. And my brother and I would imagine those prayers rising up the chimney, then bouncing off the clouds. And God, with one ear tilted, would hear the words like so many bees humming in a hive. Meanwhile, on land, down where prayers seemed, at least to my brother and to me, like birds breaking their necks on window glass, we learned a prayer of watching closely for the sudden twitching of our father's hands. And when, years later, he was dying of emphysema, I sat with him on the back porch and watched follicles of pale light sifting to the obelisks of corn stalks and studied the living funnels of dust forming on the road as our father gasped for air, the claws of his hands furious in his lap. The next poem is entitled Shell Casings. My brother would line up the bullets on the back porch and arrange them in such an exact formation that I was almost sad when he pushed the first one into the chamber. and I watched the 22 casing fly, watched the tin can jump or the blue jay become a confetti of feathers, or the squirrel drop from its high limbs to convulse on the grass before growing still. But when my brother shot Ralph, the neighbor's cat, and we buried him near my mother's tomato plants, I kept remembering as we dropped his limp body into the hole how he would rub against my legs each time I crossed in the next yard to ask Mrs. Orlean if she needed her lawn cut or her weeds plucked or her driveway shoveled. For days we heard Mrs. Orlean alternately call Ralph, Ralph, and Kitty Baby, which I found myself remembering last summer when my own cat was dying slowly of kidney failure. In Spike's final weeks, I carried him sometimes out the back porch so we could lie together by the pond, and I would look up at the old world of the sky while he studied a dragonfly flitting atop the quiet green waters. Or I would run a hand across his fur and recite as best I could the lines from the Lake Isle of Innisfree, which he seemed to appreciate more or less as I spoke the words again on the afternoon we buried him not far from my wife's tomato plants. And as I gripped the shovel, I remembered how those casings would be warmed at the touch after having flown toward me on the porch, and how Spike's fur collected and hoarded the heat of the sun as he lay with his eyes closed. And I recalled my long-dead brother touching a hand on my shoulder as we stood above the grave, and how he told me to go inside, to let him finish up, that it was all okay, that everything was okay, to trust him, it was okay. The next poem is called Sacred Departures. Like that, my mother used to say about a neighbor or relative who died, like that, snapping her fingers. Then later my brother and I would sit beneath the deformed fingers of the sky, beneath the dandelion deathheads of clouds, and snap our own fingers with the same rhythm, speak the same words, and laugh. But when our mother died at 32, like that, I dreamed of the undulant swaying of the years, how they are out and out without, how they head arc out and out without ever coming back, the hours broken vessels, the decades an occultation. Once at 9, my brother cut his foot on river rock, then bled into the shallows. Here it seemed was the covenant of going and being gone. And now that he is long dead too, I imagine the moon tonight is like a pale cyst above the roof. Once I know, my brother and I watched our father stealing tools from the garage of a neighbor, widower, who had died, carrying them away before his family could arrive from California. And once my brother was stung on the eyelid by a yellow jacket. But the moon tonight seems a lonely digression above the land, and while my wife sleeps, the sky blooms a perfect black blossom. The next poem is entitled Into the Curvature of Earth. We imagined sometimes that my brother was swimming out to where there was nothing but the tactile wheel of waves, the brine and the wet, and in this vision he was slipping forever into one more envelope of wave, ranging farther and farther from his family and friends. This was after he was out of prison that first time, after he wouldn't respond to any phone call or letter, and living, we were told, in Twin Falls, Idaho, with a pregnant addict. Often I sat in my father's kitchen, and we discussed my brother as though he had ventured out into some choppy sea at night. The epithelial moonlight so faint atop the waves it must have seemed a dream. So when we learned he'd been arrested once again, we imagined the servitude of years as one more dark expanse of liquid into which he was reaching with his arms, and we pictured him ranging so far from shore it was unlikely he was ever coming back, but was leaning his weight into the rotation of the planet, the centrifugal force of it drawing him toward the world's lip. Next is Flashing. I was up on my roof in Illinois, checking why the flashing around the chimney seemed to have so little impact on keeping out the rain, when the FBI stopped by the house to ask when I had last seen my brother. At first their words were shouted up to the roof, and my words were shouted down to the grass. But then I eased down the ladder and invited the men into my kitchen, where I offered them coffee, and told them I hadn't seen him since a few days after Christmas, and I was pretty certain he had long ago left town. I didn't ask what he'd done this time, but instead found myself telling a story to the agents about a day when we were kids and my brother sneaked into the neighbor's kitchen and stole a pie. Mrs. Orling was always baking cookies and cakes and chocolate pastries, and often we would climb the backyard ramp to her kitchen door, would be invited to stand beside her. She was maneuvering her wheelchair, and we accepted whatever sweet tidbits she handed over. So always we perked up, and the baking smells of flour and sugar came wafting through the open windows of our house. And on this occasion, my brother crept up the ramp while I watched, and a minute later he came running back with the entire pie in his hands. It turned out to be rhubarb, though, so my brother threw most of it over the fence to where a neighbor's dog was always barking. But the dog wouldn't eat the pie either. It simply nosed at the crust. Why I told this story to the FBI I don't actually know, but both agents nodded solemnly, as though this were crucial information for their case. Then we shook hands and I followed them out to their car. And before they climbed in, I pointed out that my brother wasn't actually all that bad, not when you got to know him, and he had his good traits too. And the men nodded solemnly before they drove away, and I nodded solemnly in return. And a few days later, they must have found him, for my aunt phoned to say that he was once again in jail. And then finally, I would like to read the poem entitled Breath. 2 years after my brother died, I received a letter with a return address from the prison where he'd spent his final years. The letter mentioned a book he was reading, The Maine Woods, which described a place he'd never been and suspected he would never go, or even want to, though he admitted that the length of the sentences had given him a kind of patience for description he doubted he would have cultivated on the outside. There was also a paragraph that meditated on eating breakfast at 4:30 in the morning, which was what the prison required of his wing due to overcrowding. This, too, seemed to him a matter of only the most mild interest, as though he were floating through the years on a raft in which he didn't actually believe. The letter ended with his attempt at describing a river he could see from the exercise yard, and how the mist above that river on cold mornings made him think of the breath of the long dead, which was not the kind of idea I ever would have imagined my brother might have had, especially when he combined it with a line from Thoreau with which he brought the letter to a close. The spruce and cedar on the shores hung with the gray lichen looked at a distance like the ghost of trees. That evening I carried his letter with me past the backyard and to the creek behind our house, where a faint fog of a night sky seemed a held breath, or maybe a kind of mild fever, that dream itself into a formalin of memory. And it occurred to me that the years are torsional, always twisting in more than one direction at a time, and this was what the dead would say, if only they could write to us. I began by talking about the connections between, or lack of connection sometimes, between storytelling and truth, between the difference between literal and storytelling meaning. And I do think that, I think about that a lot. I do think it's remarkable about how we can become so transfixed by novels or films about things we know never actually happened, and yet nonetheless they feel real to us, and sometimes they feel excruciatingly real. I think that's a fascinating component of us as human beings. We have that connection to stories. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Doug. So those were so filled with grief, I guess is what I kept thinking. And I'm fascinated by the idea that of the fiction, making it fiction. And I hope we'll talk more about that. So why doesn't everybody unmute at this point? And we can start a conversation. And so I'll ask if anybody has any questions that they want to start with, either in the chat, or you could say what you'd like to say. And if there aren't any questions, then I certainly have some. So let me give people a chance to think about it. Okay, well, I'll start, and then, maybe people will join in. So there's really two questions in this. Writing about grief in general, and Nancy, I know that you have some poems you didn't read from your book that are very much about mourning and loss of certain important people in your life. And Doug, your book is so, to me anyway, it's just so filled with grief. So I thought maybe we could talk a little bit about writing about grief. I certainly could say some things about it too, and maybe people in the audience as well. And think about it in terms of, when it's coming from something that you're writing about that has actually happened, and when it's coming from fiction, what or something that you're embellishing on or making up, and how that. I'm just so curious about the different ways that we can write as poets about grief, and how this connects us to each other on so many levels. So is my question specific enough, or shall I say more?
Well, I certainly feel as though when I think about grief and writing, I do think that we think of poetry as being emotional in any case, and I do think, it's an expression of emotion that has sort of that long history. And I do think that there is a way in which, if you look at the kinds of stories that exist in storytelling, certainly writing about loss is one of the central ones. You think about the idea of if stories are about what we want, what keeps us from getting what we want, the obstacles for that. Most stories are based on that sort of formula, that structure. We want things as human beings. We strive to get them, to achieve them. We face obstacles, and we either fail or succeed. And I do feel as though that there is built into that almost a sense of an arc of grief. There can also be an arc of joy if it's successful in the end, but I do think we feel that in many cases, a lot of stories that are very powerful to us, I think really are about loss. I think about a lot of novels. A lot of the novels that I've enjoyed the most in my life are really often about what went wrong, what bad things happening in our lives. And there's something, I don't know if it's cathartic, or I don't know if it's, we share it. And so the fact that we share that in common, I think is helpful to us as humans to know that we are in this together in that.
Yeah, go ahead, Nancy.
There's a difference in writing about grief when you know somebody very well, and writing about someone that you don't know very well. I'm thinking about a poem in my book. It's called White Space, and maybe I'll use it. It's a white space. Another door has clicked shut. You believe that the dying would speak of death. Maybe not. Who then do we turn to? The phone no longer rings on Sundays, and you're alert for it anyway. The mystery solved, you lay the book down gently. You resolve to keep on dancing, keep singing, even though you can't right now. The last note of the tenor's aria drifts off. The notes reverberate all day. The curtain on a life is lowered. You hear soft applause, and polite silence. You crossed out a friend's name in your address book. Try to pen a tiny epitaph. You leave white space for what you can't write.
Mm.
And I wrote that after a friend died, and I thought, I can't write about it, so, but others that I had full lives with and feel close to, the writing seems to just flow out of every pore.
Yeah, well, I find it writing about people who have died is something I do a lot.
Mm.
And I do it. Yeah, I find newspaper stories. I write about people in my life.
Mhm.
And I find it really helpful in a lot of ways. So I really, yeah, I think everything you're both saying, I completely agree with.
It's curative. It's
Mhm.
curative
Mhm.
to write.
It's that connection that we're looking for, and finding in both of your work, really finding that when hearing it and the connection to how it makes us feel. Um, so let's see what else. So Doug, do you want to talk more about how you wrote the poems in your book, and maybe talk a little bit about what was what had gotten in your way, and how that's working for you now?
Sure, and I'll start with the second half of that, which is what got in my way, which was a lot. After I received an MFA a long time ago, I was in my 20s. I entered a period of writer's block until I turned 50. So I had decades of writer's block where I would occasionally I'd give up for periods, and I would try to write a short story. I had my MFAs in fiction, and I would try to write the opening of a short story, the opening of a novel, and I would get about a few pages into it, and I made a common mistake, which is that I would take out my very favorite novels or short stories and read the opening of those and read the opening of mine, and I would think, mine suck compared to that, and then I couldn't write any farther, and so what finally happened, and I was very self-conscious about it. I was trying to think about technique, trying to think about method, what I was trying to accomplish, and after terrible frustration as a writer, when I turned 50, I decided a couple things. One, that if I produced all these first pages of things and not going beyond them, so I decided if I switched to poetry, the first good thing that would happen, I could stop at the end of a page and say I was done. That made a huge difference. But also, I think it was just that I changed my whole attitude about writing, and I began to decide that writing for me wasn't going to be conscious. It was going to exist somewhere where I was listening to voices. I feel a little bit uneasy saying that to a therapist, but that's really what I feel like. I feel like I'm an amanuensis, that I listen to voices in my head and I write down what they're saying, and I don't question it. And most of the methods that I use to try to write are based on tapping into ways of not thinking. So I have some very peculiar ways that I write. One of my favorite ways that I like to write a poem is I open up a book at random, I see a word, and that word is going to appear in my first line. And I just start writing, and I write quickly. And if I get stuck, I open up another book, and I look for another word, and I start writing again. Another technique that I very much like using is I will write very quickly. I'll write in 20 minutes. I'll write a poem. I'll write another poem in 20 minutes that has nothing to do with it. I'll write a third poem in 20 minutes that has nothing to do with either of those two. And then I'll say to myself, now put them together into one poem, and figure out how to do that. And it becomes, I twirl them around, I make changes. And so for me, the more quickly I work, the less consciously I work, the more I discover, the more I try to make it not conscious, but in some other part of my brain that I don't quite know what's going on. the better the writing becomes. What tends to work for me too is when I begin to think about, I think about as tapping into a vein. I find a voice in my head that just appeals to me for whatever reason I don't know, and then I just try to write a lot of poems in that same vein. So I wrote, it was actually the poem that came first that I wrote from Distant Fires was the one about the brothers shooting a cat, which is, I was a pretty violent kid, but I never shot a cat. So that's not a true story. My fantasies were all violent. I loved Civil War books and loved the idea of guns. And I wanted to be a soldier when I was young and all those things. Fortunately, that all faded away as I grew older. But that was, but the poem itself is not based on something real. But that poem, for some reason, really spoke to me as a writer when I wrote it, as something that just hit something that I felt real to me. And I do think that was sort of the inputs for all the rest of the poems in the book, which I wrote very quickly. Once I sort of realized that it was a poem about these two brothers, it was going to be a book about these two brothers, and where one brother took one direction, the other brother took a different direction, and the almost kind of how that can almost feel arbitrary.
Mm. Wow. Well, it's just so wonderful to hear the story of it. You know, reading it, there's so much that the reader doesn't know. So hearing you talk about it, it really opens up a different way of thinking about what you were doing there, which is interesting. You don't need that, but it does, to me, it adds some depth to understand, you know, where you were coming from and how you came up with that idea. So the idea was kind of just something that you thought about writing about, about the cat and the two brothers. That was kind of just what came to you that day, and then that's just amazing. Yeah, what an
I'm not even sure it
inspiration.
would be accurate to say that I planned it. I didn't know that I was writing a poem about that when I began. That's what I discovered when I was
Yes,
writing the poem. Yeah.
yes, yeah. The whole idea that the poem takes you somewhere, and you let that happen. Yeah, and I can't help but think, but just think about those. Was it 30 years that you couldn't write, and how that came out of that experience, and what a tragedy that is, and what it says about our, you know, institutions of higher education. Um, it's so, it just really, it's a gift to us all that you overcame that, and a testament to resiliency that, you know, to be able to do that.
I do think I had a bad experience with the MFA, but I really don't think I blame the MFA for
I
my
see.
years of writer's block.
I did.
do think
Okay,
that,
that's when I heard it. I
okay,
did, because I've heard many stories about
right.
people just feeling decimated, have to go get long-term therapy because of an MFA program. So I made that assumption there, but yeah, okay. Assumptions aren't always great to make. Oh. Yeah. So Nancy, do you want to talk about writer's block? Is that something that you've experienced? Or maybe you could talk about your writing group too. I was so impressed to hear about that.
Well, I have had a lull in writing, although I try to keep writing after I finished Lucky Enough. But one of the books that I wrote before then was the result of so many years of listening to patients and various stories, that part of the writing of some of those stories where I made every effort to make turn several patients with one diagnosis into one poem, and that was another book that just kind of flowed out. it was The Voices, the Poetry of Psychiatry. And after many years of just listening, I felt like I had to do something with all of that and also protect some confidentiality. But right now I'm in kind of a lull. Have I written everything I want to write? And maybe it's time to just do some other, look for some other fine art and be involved in. But so I guess that speaks, I don't call it being blocked, but just a lull, trying to find something that really inspires me.
Kind of the next thing. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we also need to talk a little bit, Doug, you talked a little bit about the imaginative part of writing. And I really had a lot of fun writing a poem about grandparents that I never met. And I just knew a few details of their lives. And that was fun. I wrote a love letter from my, I guess he would be my maternal grandfather, writing one to my maternal grandmother when they were separated. And it was a lot of fun, just imagining what he might say to her. And I remember he would say about coming across from Ireland, I had him say, well, you can pray your beads over hours coming and bring some of the Irish soil to me and all that kind of stuff. I never knew if he would say any of that, but it was a lot of fun writing it that way. Something
making stuff up, right?
Making it up.
Yeah. There's something that's part of the, if you can call it the fun. Sometimes for me, I guess writing feels like fun to me, but it feels like work too, or to get into a certain headspace.
Revising feels like work.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Whoa. And it sounds like, Doug, you've learned not to revise very quickly.
So impressive. Yeah.
Yeah, it is.
I think that I know a lot of poets who don't revise a lot and who spend tremendous amount of times on poems and do multiple drafts. I think the part of, for me, what I learned was that I make them worse when I revise. They probably get less good.
Sometimes you do. Yeah, sometimes you do make them worse. Yeah.
You have to know when to stop. Yeah. And when to call it a day.
I try to make revision a creative act rather than an analytical act. And I try to do it. And if I'm not satisfied with the poem, I'm more likely rather than try to revise it, I'm more likely to say, what's my favorite line in it? Just write that as a poem.
Yeah.
I just love your idea about writing 3 separate poems and then trying to link them together in some way. And I think I do something a little bit like that. I'll sometimes lately I've been finding a quote that I like. That I have no idea how I'm going to use it, but it's a quote. I just go to Goodreads and I look up an author that I really love, and I'll find a quote, and then I'll write a poem about something that has nothing to do with it, and then I try to figure out how to connect those things together. And that can be a really interesting. It's been fascinating to do it. I've enjoyed doing it. So it sounds a little bit like what you're doing.
I do think that it's working with students a lot. There are things I think that you see as patterns. And I do, not for everybody, but for a lot of students. And if you ask a class, for example, to come up with a really good metaphor for love that no one else has come up with before, that is a guarantee that everyone will look at you like, what? And be able to come up with absolutely nothing, because creativity isn't drawing something out of nothing. It's making connections between things. It's like limits. And so if you say instead, and you give some examples on the board, come up with 9 really good images, and then say, which of those images might you use to talk about love in a new way? Now students will usually come up with something really good and really interesting.
Yeah.
And it's because it's a creative process that you can do. It's just the idea of drawing something out of nothing is what's hard.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And speaking of which, I made just a little list of some of the images in your book, Doug, that there's so many and that are just so striking. And if at reading through the poems, some of them, if they don't repeat, they kind of, it's almost like a reminder of another image that you had in another poem that I just loved in terms of linking the poems together in the book. So I just wrote down a few of them. Scrim of sky, my father referred to as a riptide, epithelial moonlight. That one seems to be one that came up more than once. I'm not sure, but the world's lip, the sky secreting juices is moonlight. Lots of stuff about the sky. In a snowstorm, watching how the water and the flakes dropped without a moment's hesitation toward the land. So, and then when you were reading, there was some more that came up for me like that. So I don't know if you have anything you want to say about that, but
well, I think that's a perfect example of what I can't do, which is to say, now let's write a line. Here's what I'm trying to get across, and now let me come up with a really good metaphor, an image of a way to express that. I just can't do it. So what I have to do is I have to open a book at random or find some other way. If I open a book at random and I just see a word, and then I know I'm talking about something else, and I'm trying to push that word into it, like epithelial, all of a sudden then you're forced to sort of think about how could epithelial connect to something like moonlight, so you begin to think of it that way. So that becomes for me a process of what I can do, whereas I can't just come up with it out of nowhere.
Wow. Okay. Well, so I'm going to ask again if anybody has any questions, and it's certainly not required, or any comments that you want to make as anything that came up for you as we've been talking. And if yes, please do share. And if not, then we'll continue. There's plenty more for us to talk about. So
I've got a question for Nancy.
thanks,
Okay,
Jane.
can you hear me, Nancy?
Yes, I can.
Good.
That's
Okay,
Jane,
I want to thank you very much for your poems. I really enjoyed them. I thought they had a lot of depth and breadth and
Oh my.
My question, I have a problem with lighting here. Hold on a minute. If you don't, I'm going to turn off the light. I did take notes, but I think I have them embedded. Okay, it's about your process. The first poem about the visit to the textile museum.
Yes.
I was wondering, maybe you're not supposed to give away any trade secrets, but I was very envious of your reaction to the experience. And I was wondering if you internalized and processed immediately upon viewing the objects, or it took a while for your reaction to the items to coalesce, because you developed the visit, the reaction to your visit in such detail. I was wondering how long it took you to process your experience.
I think I made the visit to the textile museum many years before I started to write about it. And I just remembered, this princess whose clothes you were viewing. And that immediately, when I started to write, the turn that the poem took was towards my mother, who had these two daughters that my father said when he would get the charge bills, "You're creating two Svengalis." I didn't put it in that poem, but it was one of those poems where you start out at one place and you never know where the poem's going to take you. And I think it was just natural that it took me to my mother, remembering how she used to dress and how she, took us places, and led to us being fuss budgets and all that. So it percolated over the years. But once you sit down and start writing, the poem takes you a place. And I'm not that aware of my process. I'm just happy when I produce something.
So if I understand correctly, you're saying that your reaction took many years to percolate, and then you combined the visit to ideas that you had related to your childhood and your connection with your mother.
Yeah. Thank you for understanding it so clearly. Thank you.
Well, I was so envious, because whenever I visit a museum, I either take notes or, mental notes or written notes, or sometimes, like you, the idea will resurface maybe in a dream or some other experience that has a connection. But it's kind of like an ekphrastic experience, but instead of seeing a painting or a photo, it's a mental image that becomes visual.
I had that process at the Rodin Museum when I saw it in Paris, and years, later, tried to write about it and remember it. And the poem was different than that. Once you get started, the poem takes over. But I had that, I know what you mean when you go to a museum. You want to try to remember everything. And all you have to do is take grandchildren there. And my granddaughter, I took her to a science museum and I said, "Nora, you're not reading anything." And she said, "I don't want to, Nanny. I just want to see it all." So,
yeah, thanks so much for your question, Jane.
yes.
And thank you, Nancy, for explaining your reaction and the process, because I guess it's a combination of imagination and actual experience, and the two kind of set one another off. And without imagination, you would not have a poem, right?
Oh, yeah. Thank you.
So let's see. So I think Mary Marcia has, so Mary Marcia has a question. For Nancy, what's the hat that your mother sometimes neglected to take off? Do you have an interest in fashion particularly?
When she was cooking dinner. Yes. It just varied, she'd just come in the door and start right away. But she loved hats, and she had a girlfriend who used to make us hats. And I remember going for a job in high school, and she told me to wear a hat. And I said, "Are you kidding me?" And I did get the job, and I think she was right. But, you know, hats were important for her. And she had a girlfriend who would take us, and we were part of the whole creative process. And a friend would come over on Easter evening and finish up the hat, and we'd wear it to church the next day. And my brother would say, "I'm not sitting with them." So it was definitely the females in the household that were interested in fashion and all that.
Cool. So let's see. Yeah, we're coming down to we're getting close to finishing up. So if there's any comments or things that people in the audience would like to let the readers know, now would be the time. And I'm going to also ask if either one of you, I don't know if I asked you about having a poem to take us out, a closing poem. Did I ask you for that? I may not have. So if you can think of something, that would be great. Sorry to put you on the spot. And while you're doing that, let's see if anybody else has a comment or a question that they might have.
Let's see, a poem. I have a prose piece that's kind of long.
Yeah, something short, probably. How about you, Doug?
Okay.
Do you have something?
I do.
Okay. All right, great. So yeah, let me thank everybody for coming. And it's been really wonderful. And now we're going to have some closing poems.
Okay. I wrote a series of poems where I became interested in taking historical and fictional and mythological characters and placing them in the present day. And so this one was, I imagined Dr. Mengele, the Nazi war criminal, as a Walmart greeter. So the title of the poem is Blue Toaster. In the final summer of his life, Dr. Mengele took a job as a greeter at a Walmart in Miami. He rented a small room above a bodega. In the evenings, he read the Aeneid or took a bus to the beach so he could stand in the sand slathered with sunscreen and watch the waves grow slowly gray, then disappear. For a short time, he kept a dream journal, expecting to write about gypsies, dwarves, twins, Jews, castration, transfusions, sex changes, and surgeries. But instead, he dreamed each night of the shy shop girl he'd adored when he was a young boy at the Günzburg Gymnasium, or about the blue toaster he had bought a few days earlier with his employee discount at Walmart, or about how much his long-lost son, Rolf, would have liked the French fries at McDonald's or the salsa music that always seemed to be vibrating against his apartment window after midnight. Only for a brief while did he collect assassin bugs in pickle jars to see how they would respond to being left on his baking windowsill at noon, but eventually he let them go and drank an American beer and listened to the Florida Marlins on the radio. At work, he learned to smile and nod as each customer arrived to the automatic doors. It was a small miracle, he thought. The doors whooshed open, and there they were. And only sometimes did he recall the railhead at Auschwitz, where he would point to each prisoner to the left or to the right. Now he pointed toward the appliance section, or maybe to the toys, and small children occasionally ran up to hold his hand.
Oh, wow. Wow. I'm speechless. Wow,
Okay,
thank you.
I have a shorter poem about
Thanks, Nancy.
the end of a most significant relationship for me. It's entitled Aurora. I gave you the dawn of my stormy life, the fullness of my hair, the assuredness of my walk, the energy for the struggle, my singleness of purpose, my laughing face, it mirrored yours. Yet you did not live to say you were aware of the simple truth. I lost too. I lost you. Beginning our love in the daylight of youth, a gift. I find you anew as I write. Our love not an illusion written in sand. This comes to me in the evening of my years.
Oh, thank you so much. So we're going to have one more reading after this one with Grayson readers, and then I'm going to take a break over the summer and come back, hopefully come back in September or late August with some more readings.
Thanks, Phyllis, for all you've done to get this off and running. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. Yeah, it's been my pleasure too. To get to know
thank you.
writers. Yeah, go ahead, Doug.
No, I just was going to say thank you. It is really, really great that you watched this and put this out there.
Thank you. Yeah, it's been a really amazing experience for me too. So thank everybody again, and hopefully we'll see you next time.
Okay.
Take care. Be safe.
Thank you.